Welcome everyone to today's webinar. I am Anuja Vaidya with Becker's Hospital Review. We will begin today's webinar with a presentation and we'll have time at the end of the hour for a question and answer session. You can submit any questions you have throughout the webinar by typing them into your control panel in the space labeled Enter a Question for Staff and clicking Send. We are looking forward to hearing your questions. Additionally, in about a week following the webinar, we will be sending you a copy of the presentation to the email you used to register. At this time, it is now my pleasure to start today's webinar by introducing our presenter, John Bartis, CEO of CollectRx. Mr. Bartis is a veteran in the field of healthcare and information technology. As president of Dr. First Inc. and executive vice president of Inc., Mr. Bartis has specialized in providing cost containment services to health insurers and various products and services to hospitals, health systems, and other healthcare providers. Previously, Mr. Bartis was an attorney at Kirkpatrick and Lockhart LLP, now K&L Gates, where his practice focused on litigation. Mr. Bartis's clients have included a wide range of for-profit and not-for-profit health insurers, including Blue Cross Blue Shield of Florida, Humana, Capital Blue Cross, Kaiser Permanente of the Mid-Atlantic region, CareFirst, and Blue Cross Blue Shield of Massachusetts. Mr. Bartis has also worked on behalf of numerous hospitals and health systems, including Henry Ford Health System and MedStar Health, along with hundreds of physician practices. Mr. Bartis is a graduate of Princeton University and received his JD from the American University Washington College of Law, where he graduated summa cum laude and was a member of Law Review. John, I'll now turn the floor over to you.
Thank you very much for that introduction. Everyone, I'm John Bartis. I'm CEO of CollectRx, and I'm very pleased here today to talk about the opportunity to significantly increase your profits by maximizing the opportunity around out-of-network. So more specifically, I'll be talking about CollectRx's background and talk about the out-of-network opportunity, both from the perspective of a financial point of view as well as from a market standpoint. I'll spend a few minutes talking about how to put together an out-of-network strategy, and then I'll spend a lot of time talking about tips to maximizing your reimbursements on individual out-of-network bills and improve your revenue and profits by doing so. And then finally, I'll wrap up by talking about third-party rental network agreements, how they work, and what are the pitfalls that make them so detrimental from a provider point of view. And the objective when we leave here today is I hope you have a better understanding of some of the issues surrounding out-of-network reimbursements and how you might, back in the office, so to speak, take advantage of some of the tips that I've offered and improve your reimbursements by doing so. So before I dive into these topics, let me give you just a quick summary of our experience at CollectRx with respect to out-of-network reimbursements, give you an idea of sort of where we're coming from and our perspective on these issues. Now, despite our name, we're not a collections agency. We have nothing to do with the pharmaceutical industry. Simply put, what we do is we help providers get higher reimbursements on out-of-network bills. We do this not as consultants, but as experts in negotiating higher out-of-network reimbursement rates. We're the only company in the country that's laser focused on helping providers in this regard. We work with more than 1,300 providers nationwide, and we process more than $1 billion in out-of-network bills each year. We work with a variety of different provider groups, from hospitals to surgery centers to labs to physician groups, really all types of providers. And there are really two keys to our success that help us get the results that we get. One is what we call CRIXIS, which stands for CollectRx Information System. This is a proprietary data and analytics tool that we've developed internally to help us as we go face-to-face with the payers. CRIXIS runs our operational processes, and it also helps provide information with respect to insurance policies, comparable data for our negotiation team, and tracking the trends and tendencies of the folks on the insurance company side of the aisle. Crixus is complemented by our expertise. What we've done that's unique is we've built a team of people who used to work for the insurance companies and or the vendors with respect to out-of-network issues. And as a result, part of our secret sauce, frankly, is the depth at which we understand how those entities operate. So with that as sort of brief background, let me switch gears and talk about the out-of-network opportunity, starting with the financial side. So as providers look at the landscape today, there aren't a lot of opportunities to improve your reimbursement rates. Your in-network contracts, for the most part, are what they are. There's very little, if any, opportunity to move the needle with respect to the rates on those agreements. And obviously, with respect to Medicare and Medicaid cases, there's literally no opportunity to improve those rates. So out-of-network really represents the last great opportunity for a lot of providers to improve their reimbursements and therefore improve the bottom line. So to give you a sense of the opportunity with respect to out-of-network bills, I put together the chart that you see here. So let's suppose, hypothetically, we're dealing with a surgery center that has $5 million in revenue, generates 15% of that revenue from out-of-network patients, and operates at a margin, at 20% margins. So if the ASC in this example is able to increase the the allowable amount by 1/3, meaning that the payer increases the RNC amount by 33%, which is typically what we do for our clients, this will result in a $250,000 incremental reimbursement in profit. Now, if you're operating at 20% margins, that $250,000 additional reimbursement translates into $1.2 million of additional revenue at your current margins. But let's say that you don't quite get that much of your business from out-of-network, and it's 5% instead of 15%. This still results in a $400,000 increase of revenue, again, using 20% margins. So, think of it another way, or put it another way. So, suppose you were in a contract with a payer who represented a small amount of your business, but came to you and said, hey, we'll improve your reimbursement rates by 33%. Well, if that were to happen, I think everybody on the phone would be more than happy for that to occur, but it shows really the power that exists, or the opportunity that exists for providers to take advantage of that opportunity. So that's sort of the financial side of the opportunity. Let me talk about it from sort of a market perspective, and why this out-of-network opportunity will continue as we go forward in the future. Now, first of all, and despite efforts of the payers to reduce out-of-network reimbursements, it's a $60 billion plus market, and it's continued to grow over the last several years. No reason to think it won't grow going forward. A second reason that out-of-network will continue to be an important piece of the reimbursement landscape is the sustained growth in PPO enrollment. Most out-of-network bills come from PPO members, and PPO enrollment has more than doubled as HMOs have declined, and studies show that 10 to 20% of PPO members will have an out-of-network experience each year. We're also seeing, and will continue to see, an increase in what are called narrow networks. Narrow networks have been put together by the payers to place limits on providers that can participate in a given network. And to be clear, this isn't just outlier providers. It's, in some markets, it's major players in those markets that are being left out due to these narrow networks. Now, by definition, narrow networks means fewer providers will be in network, and as such, these narrow networks will continue to result in there being more out-of-network care. But by far the biggest and most important reason the out-of-network isn't going anywhere is that people want to have the choice of provider. They want to be able to pick their doctor, they want to be able to pick their hospital, they want to be able to pick their surgery center. And you have that demand, and people are willing to pay for that demand. So as long as that's there, the payers will have no choice but to sell policies with out-of-network benefits, And of course, they don't mind receiving the premiums as well. And while the prevalence of opportunities to improve out-of-network reimbursements may vary by geography and individual factors, it's clear that it's here to stay. So now let me switch gears here and talk about how you might think about devising an out-of-network strategy. And as we discussed before, out-of-network reimbursements tend to be higher than in-network reimbursements. And given what we talked about in terms of our background, you might think automatically that we would recommend that you go 100% out-of-network, but that in fact is not the case. What we see every day with respect to the customers that we deal with is a different approach, which we've labeled the hybrid strategy. What we see providers executing is sort of a hybrid strategy between, with some of their business being from out-of-network, some of their business being from in-network, and that's the best way to put you in a position to maximize your revenue. So in other words, we recommend a strategy in which the provider goes in-network with some payers and stays out-of-network with other payers, and do so make the decisions accordingly by following the steps I'll describe on the next few slides. So when putting together your out-of-network strategy and determining which payers you might want to be out-of-network with, the factors to consider include what's the local payer mix, what's the local employer mix, how do reimbursement levels compare between being in-network and out-of-network, the relative market share of the provider as compared with other providers. Now, if providers are prudent in picking and choosing with whom they should be out-of-network and really attacks the out-of-network issues and tips that we talk about later in the presentation, that's the way to maximize revenue and profits. Now, for some providers, of course, there is no choice to be out-of-network. They have a lack of leverage in the marketplace, so they really don't have the ability to enter into managed care contracts, even if they wanted to. But assuming that the provider doesn't have that type of limitation, how does it decide which payers with whom they should sign a contract and with whom they should stay out-of-network? So doing a comparison of the reimbursement levels between being in-network and out-of-network is the way to go. And what we recommend is that you don't try to boil the ocean, so to speak. You select a handful up to 10, let's say, of your most common procedures. And what you do is do a side-by-side comparison with respect to each of those procedures as to what the reimbursement levels would be. So you pick the procedure, you project the number of cases that you would receive for that procedure, multiply that by the average distribution level, and then you have the total reimbursement level. Again, let's suppose you started doing this with in-network. You would have the in-network result here. And then you flip the page, so to speak, and do the same analysis with respect to out-of-network for that procedure. So you look at that procedure, you project the number of cases, multiply that by the average reimbursement level, and again, you'd get the total reimbursement level for the in-network, for the out-of-network side. So then you go through these equations for your various procedures and come up with an analysis in terms of with whom you're better off being in-network and who you're better off being out-of-network. Now, once you've done that analysis, what do you do then? Well, what we recommend is dip your toe in the water approach. When you're talking about folks who have been in-network for a number of years, they're not familiar with the various parameters and requirements with respect to out-of-network. And so I wouldn't recommend that you go out there and cancel all your contracts today and go 100% out-of-network, but rather to dip your toe in the water, take a more conservative approach, which basically comprises of taking that analysis we talked about before. If you have a relatively smaller payer that comes out of that analysis where there's an opportunity, that's the one to pick to go out-of-network first. Be out-of-network with that payer for 4 to 6 months, see how your reimbursements are doing, see how you're able to implement the tips that I'm going to be talking about in a bit, and then make the decision whether it makes sense to expand and go a little deeper in the water, or it makes sense to hold off and not do so. So that's the way you should think about this in terms of putting together a strategy with respect to your out-of-network. So now let's turn to some of the issues that we see on a daily basis in the market as we go up against the payers every day on behalf of our customers. Now, you need to remember that the payers and the vendors who work for the payers, helping them reduce out-of-network reimbursements, what they're doing is they're continually looking for ways to underpay claims. In other words, they engage in cost containment initiatives, like getting you to enter into third-party rental network agreements that I'll discuss later. And they utilize narrow networks, they send payments to the patient, sometimes they threaten providers. All of this is designed at getting the provider to give up and accept lower reimbursements than they should on their out-of-network bills. So as a foundational point, let me talk about how out-of-network bills are processed so everybody has the same understanding in terms of how this works. Now, it starts with the provider generating an out-of-network bill. That bill is sent to the insurance company, and the insurance company transfers it to one of the vendors that I was talking about before. It then will either subject the bill to negotiation or it will be repriced. And how that decision is made is not known to a lot of providers. The bottom line answer is that the decision in terms of how to deal with these bills really is at the employer level, not at the payer level. In other words, when an insurance company sells to an employer group, the employer has the ability to dial up or down the out-of-network benefits. And there's a basic trade-off here, a trade-off between patient discontent and the payment of premiums. In other words, the higher the premiums, the lower the discontent. The lower the premiums, the higher the discontent. And these dials take many forms. In other words, does the employer want the payer to negotiate settlements, and if so, at what rates? What's the maximum allowed amount when bills are repriced? Is there an opportunity to push to get additional payments when a bill is repriced? And the irony of the whole thing is no matter how the employer decides to go about this, the payers are able to put together data to support that decision. So in this context, the payers look to control costs. They outsource the implementation of bill minimization tactics to companies that specialize in helping payers reduce payments to providers either through negotiation services or repricing services, or both. You may have heard of these companies: Multiplan, Viant, NCS, GCS, to name a few. Collectively, we at CollectRx refer to these companies as vendors that help the payers attempt to control their costs in this capacity. Their goal, just to be clear, is to maximize the discount. And the reason why? Because that's how they make their money. The vendors are compensated on a commission basis. The greater the discount on a particular bill, the higher the commission. So how do the vendors deploy a bill minimization strategy? Well, on a bill-by-bill basis, vendors will attempt to minimize reimbursements either through either one of the following methods. First, they might negotiate single-case rate agreements with the provider. Now, usually these agreements start with the vendor sending a proposal to reduce the bill in exchange for the provider agreeing not to balance bill to patient for the discounted amount. Alternatively, as part of the bill minimization tactics, the vendor might simply just reprice the bill to a low amount. Now, over the last 10 years, CollectRx has come up against over 800 companies that assist payers with reducing out-of-network reimbursements to providers through these bill minimization tactics. And that number is constantly changing. In the past 3 months, we've dealt with about 15 new vendors in this regard. And these vendors are literally costing providers billions of dollars per year. So the natural question, of course, is what can you do about it? Let me go through some tips and how you can fight the payers, get higher reimbursements, and make more money. Now, one tip is that you should have a rigorous appeals process in place. Now, appeals occur when payers reprice a bill at a low amount, and basically what you're doing by appealing is trying to engage the payer to make a second payment. Now, remember, from the insurance company's perspective, they're done. They made a determination of what is reasonable and customary, made the payment, and now it's up to you to get them to change their minds. It can be a labor-intensive process to appeal an underpayment and obtain a higher payment, but here I've laid out at a 25-foot level the general process that we follow here at CollectRx in terms of dealing with appeals on behalf of our clients. The first step is initial intake. You need to ensure that you have the documentation necessary to handle the claim. This means you need to have the explanation of benefits, the assignment of benefits, the bill itself, and whether there are any notes or other relevant documentation to the case. Then step 2 is payer verification, contacting the payer to verify the patient and bill information and obtain a verbal explanation for the basis of the deductions. The next step, step 3, is the strategy development. That is devising the appropriate strategy for a given claim. What facts do you want to present? What arguments do you want to present? And of course, as part of that process, when we handle these cases, is we use our CRIX's business intelligence engine and the data and analytics that come from there. But then step 4 is you engage with the payer. You present the facts that you want to present, you present the arguments. You need to be very persistent. You need to make calls every day at times. You need to write letters frequently. You need to understand how to escalate the bill. For instance, you might want to escalate it to the state insurance commission in certain situations. And once you fully present the information to the payers typically wait a few weeks as they reconsider their decision. And then that leads to the final step, which is when you're successful, you want to make sure that you follow up to make sure you get paid correctly. Frequently, you're paid correctly. Sometimes you won't be. So you need to make sure you stay on it and get the reimbursement that you've earned. Another tip is to have the data to support and prove that the insurance company's payments are inaccurate. You need to be able to argue that the insurance company's reimbursement levels is inconsistent with your own history and preferably the history of the other providers in the community. Now, just to be clear, from a data perspective, the payers and the vendors, they know a lot about you. They have databases that track every past negotiation. So when an out-of-network bill is input, a screen will pop up with the names, the titles, the phone numbers of the folks in your business office. And that screen might say, don't go to Mary, she'll only give you a 20% discount. Go to Bill, he'll give you a 40% discount. So the next tip is with respect to your explanation of benefits, and this will permeate a lot of the points that I make sort of through the rest of the presentation. But you need to have the ability to read and understand your EOBs. And of course, that's easier said than done, as EOBs are often very difficult to decipher. I've included here a couple of examples of actual language from EOBs just to sort of highlight how confusing they can be. So you have the first EOB here, talks about the payment of benefits being made in accordance with the terms of the managed care system. Well, when you read that sentence, you might think, okay, this is an in-network reimbursement because of the reference to the managed care system. Whereas, in fact, this is actually an out-of-network EOB. The reference to the managed care system is just including out-of-network as being part of the broader managed care system. Then you have the second EOB, where the sort of the kitchen sink example, which talks about the charge exceeding fee schedule / maximum allowable or contracted / legislated fee arrangement. It gives 4 possible reasons for whatever reduction was made on that given case. You know, again, in a busy business office, you have to make sure that you devote the resources to dig deeper and figure out what really happened with respect to that case. Another tip has to do with your assignment of benefits. You need to have a well-drafted assignment of benefits, and we're not offering legal advice as we sit here today, but there are a few items that you want to have in mind as you put together the right assignment of benefits. One is you want to make sure that you have the right to appeal and the right to receive relevant documentation as well as other rights. You want to refer to the provider as the patient's authorized representative. You want to properly reference ERISA in a full and fair review of claims. And you need to have this because the assignment of benefits is what puts you in the shoes of the patient in terms of going after the payer to get the reimbursement you deserve. If an AOB is inadequate, it's another roadblock that the payers can use to stop you from getting reimbursed on your out-of-network bills. A lot of what we talk about here today is roadblocks being put up in a number of different regards with respect to these issues. And the goal from the payer and vendor's perspective is if they put enough roadblocks up, you'll give up and walk away. Another tip has to do with the short turnaround time issue. When the vendors opt to settle cases through negotiations, they often do so by sending proposals that have a short turnaround time for a response. Their goal is to put pressure on the provider to settle quickly. But the truth of the matter is sometimes these turnaround times are real and sometimes they aren't. You shouldn't take that for granted. The next tip, the role of a contract. So another tactic that payers try to deploy is to try to beat a contracted rate by negotiating a lower rate. So for example, they might have a third-party rental agreement that calls for reimbursement at X%. What they will do is they'll give it to a vendor saying, look, if you can beat X%, we'll pay you a commission for doing so. Again, if you're not on top of this, you won't even realize that it's happening. The next tip has to do with avoiding the portal. Let me explain sort of what I mean by this. What some vendors do, they use a portal to send these proposed single case rate agreements to providers. Providers do this because it's easy, it's efficient, and all those sorts of things. But what they don't realize is the portals are set up so you can't negotiate the case. In fact, some vendors literally won't even take calls regarding cases that have been transmitted via the portal. But they cut you off at the legs in terms of your ability to negotiate the case. The next tip has to do with tracking third-party contracts. We talk about this at length in the last section here, but basically what vendors do is they sell contracts to providers that promise great rates. The catch, and what they don't want you to know, is that they apply various cuts like UNC and multiple procedure reduction cuts. So many times your final rate is just a fraction of what you thought it would be. And again, that is if you checked. Again, most providers aren't checking their EOBs to make sure they're getting paid correctly. And again, it's hard to blame them. They can be time consuming, but necessary if you want to take advantage of the opportunity here. Another thing that the payers don't want you to do is to seek a retro authorization. Sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes you can get an authorization after the fact. So if you have a claim that's been denied on these grounds, don't give up. Try to get authorization after the fact. There's also the next tip, the persistence game. That really gets to the heart of this in terms of, who's going to win the battle of the wills. The payers and vendors, they're putting up obstacles to success, and they're banking literally that you'll get up and walk away. Their goal, their sole aim is to get you to throw in the towel. They know you're busy. They know you don't have the time to do this. And so, and remember that they get paid on a commission basis, so that if you do give up, they win. So ultimately, to succeed, you have to have the persistence to continue fighting for the reimbursement you deserve. Next tip, they're not your friends. We hear providers say all the time that they have a great relationship with the vendors. I can tell you that's exactly what the vendors want you to believe. Remember, they're not your friends. They are compensated based on how much money they save their clients, the insurance companies. They are continually trying to find new ways not to pay you any more money. And then the final point here has to do with outsourcing. Even if a provider has the skill, expertise, and data to be successful to improve their out-of-network reimbursements at the levels we talked about earlier, a lot of times they don't have the time. And think about it from this perspective. You have these major insurance companies, worth billions of dollars, who have vast amounts of money, resources, data at their disposal. How do they deal with these issues? They outsource it. It's at least something that you should consider as you go about putting together your strategy. Okay, so those are the tips. Let me now switch gears one final time and talk about another cost containment tactic being used increasingly by the payers to reduce out-of-network reimbursement, the so-called third-party rental network agreements, also the so-called silent PPOs, and these include continuous discount agreements. This is a topic we get asked about all the time. We have prospective customers and current customers ask us frequently to take a look at their proposed contracts or the contracts they have in place to see if they want to enter into them or to cancel them. And so I'm going to go over some of the points you need to consider in that context. But before I do, from a definitional perspective, what is a third-party rental network agreement? Well, the third-party rental network agreements are agreements signed not with an individual payer, but with a third party that contracts with a lot of payers. You can think of these third parties as sort of middlemen of sorts. They bring together payers and providers to participate in contracts that are often not favorable from a provider perspective for a number of reasons. Moreover, they are often offered to other payers and networks that the provider doesn't even know about, the so-called silent PPOs. Again, they sound easy, sort of like the portal. With one stroke of the pen, you can contract with a number of different payers that have agreed to pay at the terms on the other end. But what most providers don't realize is that those terms are very detrimental from a provider perspective. So it's important to understand who is the customer with respect to these agreements. And just to be clear, it's not the patient, it's not the provider, it is the insurance company. I encourage you, go back and look at their websites and you'll see it right there. The reason this is important is they're not there to serve you, but they're there to serve the insurance companies. And they do this as a cost containment initiative. So think about it. If they're helping the insurance companies save money, somebody must be losing money, and that loss is being borne by the providers. So let me go through some of the key issues to consider as you think about these agreements. Some of you might be even considering entering into them. Let me point out some of the problems that these bring to the table. Again, they sound easy and attractive because they're so easy to implement, but they do have these various pitfalls that you need to be aware of. So the first one has to do with patient steerage, and be clear that these agreements typically have no patient steerage in these agreements. What does that mean? Well, in the traditional managed care contracting, the sort of one-on-one, meaning one provider, one payer types of contracts, those are basically volume discount agreements. In other words, the provider is saying, look, I'll accept patients at a discounted rate, and in return, the payer will promote the provider among its customers, its employees. So with respect to these third-party rental network agreements, you have the discount all right, but you don't have any more patients. You don't get that patient steerage as a result. Another point to remember is that a lot of providers don't even realize that they've entered into these agreements. I can't tell you how frequently we'll start working with a new customer and be the first to inform them that they've had various contracts in place for years that they didn't even know about. Again, because a lot of providers don't rigorously check their EOBs, and because EOBs in any event are so difficult to read, they don't even realize that they entered into these agreements sometimes years ago. So make sure that you have a handle on the contracts that you're in. The next is, are the payers required to use a contract? And the answer is no, for a variety of reasons. To begin with, payers have multiple agreements in place, and they choose the one with the best rate. Also, there may be claims such as limited benefit policy claims that they don't want to use the agreement to price. In other words, if the reimbursement level would be lower than the contracted rate, they won't take the contract. If the reimbursement level would be higher than the contracted rate, well, that's when they will use the contract. Another point to consider, of course, a core point, is what do the reimbursement levels look like? Again, as we've talked about a couple times, out-of-network reimbursements industry-wide are generally higher and sometimes much higher than contracted reimbursements. So you want to know, how do the reimbursement levels compare to being out-of-network? A related point is how the reimbursement levels are calculated. More specifically, are they based on a percentage of billed charges or allowed charges? And sometimes providers don't realize that the reimbursement levels are being based as a percentage of allowed charges and not billed charges. This means that payers take a cut to arrive at the allowed amount, then apply the discount to that lowered amount to determine the payment level. So let's say you have a case with $10,000 in billed charges, and the agreement says that they're reimbursing at 70% of allowed charges. So the way this is calculated is the payer starts by determining the allowed charges. So let's say, for example, let me lay out the numbers here. Hopefully this will make sense. Assuming that you had billed charges of $10,000, and then the payer allows it at 60% or $6,000. Then the payer would apply the discounted rate from the contract, the 70%, to that $6,000, resulting in a reimbursement level of $4,200. So, you talk to a lot of providers, and they would think under this contract, in this situation, they'd get $7,000. Bill charges are 10, their discounted rate is 70% of $10,000 is $7,000. But they'd be incorrect. The way it would actually work is it would be $4,200 because it would be the 70% of $6,000, the allowed amount. Another important point to keep in mind is the termination provision. Typically, these contracts are for one-year terms and are subject to what's called an evergreen clause, meaning that they automatically renew on a yearly basis unless terminated by the other party. The catch here, the gotcha, is the notice period to terminate. Sometimes the notice period in these agreements is 180 days, meaning that you have to give at least 6 months notice just to terminate. And there's another condition, the notice must be at least 180 days prior to the anniversary date of the contractual period. So let's take a sort of a real-world example so you can see how onerous this is. Let's suppose that you entered into an agreement on July 1, 2015, and then decided subsequently in April 2016, about 8 months later, that you want to terminate it. Since it's less than 180 days from the anniversary date of July 1, 2016, you couldn't cancel it until July 1, 2017. In other words, the following anniversary date. So that means you're not able to terminate the contract for well over a year from your decision to do so. The next key to consider is whether the payers are applying in-network discounts with out-of-network benefits. And the answer is yes. Most providers, however, they just assume that since they've agreed to an in-network benefit level, that's what's being applied when they accepted the discount. We call it double dipping here, because what happens is the payer gets the advantage of the lower discounted rate, but then the higher out-of-network benefits. The next key to consider is with respect to administrative handbooks. Now, these are handbooks that some of these companies create that have additional terms that are incorporated by reference into the contract itself. But providers don't really think of it that way. They don't really read these handbooks prior to entering into the contract, and they're certainly not keeping up with each new version that comes out. But that's a way for the payers or the vendors to get essentially contractual terms without putting it in the main body of the contract. So an example of that might be how multiple procedure reductions are going to be treated. The main contract might be silent with respect to that issue, but it's then dealt with in the administrative handbook. And again, providers aren't understanding that that's what's happening. I've even heard of folks who have had fundamental reimbursement amounts changed essentially by the use of the administrative handbook. So the bottom line is, if you're in one of these agreements, you should be thinking of whether you should cancel it. Similarly, if you're considering entering into these agreements, think hard before you do so. As you can see, in a lot of instances, they hurt, not help your reimbursement. You can almost think, one way of sort of thinking about these agreements are, these are fee caps. And the reason why I would say that is, let's say that you have one of these agreements and it's the reimbursement rate is 60%. Well, if the case would have been resolved above 60% but for the contract, what's the payer going to do? They're going to apply the contract to get the lower rate. Now, if the case were going to be dealt with below the 60%, what's the payer going to do? They're going to go at the below the 60% level and not apply the contract. So again, the reimbursement rate will never be above 60% when you have these contracts, and sometimes will be below. So one last point to wrap up with has to do with what are called continuous discount agreements, which are sort of a cousin to the third-party rental network agreements that I've been talking about. So basically, the way these continuous discount agreements come about is sometimes on those settlement proposals that we've talked about, they'll include a box, a checkbox. And next to the checkbox, it'll say, check here if you want to accept these reimbursement levels going forward. And once again, sometimes these are checked off without the provider even realizing it. Again, I can't tell you how many times that we see folks that have these continuous discount agreements in place that don't even know it. They contain a lot of the same sort of problems that the third-party rental network agreements have, patient steerage, reimbursement rates, etc. One thing that they don't have, which is good, is an onerous termination provision. Usually they can be terminated with 30 days notice. So if you are in one, you can get out of it. But it is important, if you do decide to terminate one of those agreements, you then follow up on your EOBs to make sure that it got implemented. I've seen occasions where they don't. So, in sum, hopefully you have a better idea of what's happening with respect to out-of-network. And remember that when done right, proper out-of-network reimbursement management is one of only a few ways that you can improve your reimbursements and improve the bottom line. So that's my presentation. I do have looks like a couple minutes for questions.
Yes, thank you, John, for that fantastic presentation. We will now begin today's question and answer session. Please submit any questions you have by typing them into your control panel in the space labeled Enter a Question for Staff and clicking Send. We will try to get through as many questions as we have time for. So our first question over here is, I have a multi-plan contract, but the insurance company I'm out of network with isn't accessing it. Why is that?
So, we touched on some of this, but, just to be clear, insurance companies are not required to use the contracts, and there are a number of situations or reasons that they might not do so. these insurance companies, number one, these insurance companies enter into sort of a web of these agreements. And literally when they get a claim, they process it through that web to figure out the lowest possible payment, and they'll select that contract. Well, by definition, the other contracts that they decided not to use it for obviously are not being used. In addition, for certain types of claims, such as those involving limited benefit policies, where those reimbursements are less than the contracted rate, that's when the payer is going to not use the contract. And then sometimes they'll give a case to a negotiation vendor and tell the vendor, if you can get a discount, we'll pay you a commission. So in other words, there's really no definitive way that you'll know what's happening with respect to whether the contract is accessed.
Got it. Thank you so much. Our next question is, I was reimbursed at 3 times as much with one patient than the other, even though they have the same insurance company with the same procedure. How did this happen?
So ultimately, it's really not the insurance company that's driving the determination of what is reasonable and customary for a given bill. That decision is really made at the employer group level. And the groups, they determine not only the out-of-network benefits, they also control the methodology being used to determine reasonable and customary amounts. Now, on occasion, there may be a difference even within the same group, which again is another reason you need to be vigilant and review your EOBs.
Fantastic. Thanks for clarifying that. Our next question is, it was my understanding that as an out-of-network provider, we can bill the patient the difference between what the insurance pays us and our bill charges. Is that correct?
So generally, the answer is yes. If the claim was simply repriced, the provider can charge the patient for both the discounted amount and patient responsibility, copays, coinsurance, deductibles, etc. But if you have entered into a single case rate agreement on a case, they do specify that the provider can charge the patient the discounted amount. They still can charge the patient for patient responsibility, copays, deductibles, coinsurance, but not for that discounted amount.
I see. Okay, great. Our next question is, how do I increase payment in silent PPOs?
I'm sorry, I couldn't quite get that question.
Oh, I'm sorry. The question is, how do I increase payments and reduce access to silent PPOs?
Well, there's not much you can do to control it. It sort of is what it is. Really, the best way is to cancel your third-party rental network agreements as a way of controlling access.
Okay, got it. Our next question is, how do payers determine what to pay OON providers?
So payers and their vendors, they have pretty wide discretion in how they determine what to pay out-of-network providers, after, of course, the employer preference is taken into account. Factors that they use, include billed charges, procedures performed, the geography, previous cases, etc. So it's really sort of, there are a lot of tools at the payer and vendors' fingertips to deal with these issues.
Okay, got it. Fantastic. Our next question is, I heard that Multiplan owns Viant. Is that true?
Yeah. Multiplan does own Viant. It owns other companies in this space, like NCN, like Beach Street. It makes it easy for them to implement different contracts for different entities because of the relationships that they have with each other.
I see. Interesting. Fantastic. So our next question is, what is the most common mistake I should be looking for?
Good question. I think the most common mistake that we see folks make is not to negotiate. You know, you're better off doing a deal most of the time, not all the time, but most of the time, than taking your chances on the bill being repriced at an acceptable level.
Okay, great. Fantastic. So our next question is, are all third-party networks something to be concerned about?
Well, I mean, I would say the answer to that is yes. You know, virtually all of the contracts have the problems that we were talking about. You know, patient steerage, double dipping, termination, et cetera. You know, and our team, I mean, we're well versed in these issues. We get approached all the time, and you know, we do offer a complimentary analysis of these cases, of these contracts for folks that want them.
Okay, great. So our next question asks, can you revisit the topic of the portal? And would this be equivalent to using an electronic clearinghouse to submit claims?
Well, they're really different. I mean, the clearinghouse really has to do, as you said, with claim submission. The portal is really a means of communicating between the vendors and the provider with respect to single case rate agreements, sort of a totally different topic. And again, the portals really act as a barrier for you to adequately negotiate a case.
Okay, I see. Fantastic. So I think we have time for one last question over here. The question is, I have been contracted by an organization that claims to deliver a network where out-of-network insurance will reimburse me at 70%. Is this a third-party contract?
You know, obviously I don't have it in front of me, so I can't say for sure, but it definitely sounds like it. Again, if you want to contact me offline to talk about it, you know, I'd be happy to do so.
Okay, great. Well, thanks so much. That is all we have time for today. I want to thank John for his excellent presentation and to our audience for participating today. Enjoy the rest of your day, and we look forward to having you join us for future webinars.